Dr. Cole's going to share his screen, I assume, and he's going to share with us the last segment now of marketing segmentation and targeting the right consumer, how to maintain your group cohesiveness. Dr. Cole, thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to it. I think John will help you to share.
Thank you, Kevin. And I appreciate you organizing this and holding it together in a virtual format, which I think is better than a second best in today's day. And appreciate the lectures thus far, and I always learn something. In reference to my talk, let me go back. Hang on, bear with me. So I'm going to basically embody everything you just said in the concept of sort of the business of sports medicine, and talk about practice development, different practice models, verticals and ancillaries and so forth, and provide an overview of where we are today. Just as a point of context, I'm currently the managing partner at Midwest Orthopedics at Rush, and we're a 50-person physician group with about 50 or 60 advanced practitioners. We have about 500 employees, affiliated with ownership of variable interest, about 7 surgery centers, 10 physical therapy centers, and 7 clinics. So just to give you a sense of size and scale, and we're sort of an academic private practice. And so we're a hybrid of a lot of different types of environments. Sometimes it's an academic, sometimes it's private, sometimes it's mid-size. It behaves like a big practice and sometimes behaves like a small practice. And I'll try to give you an overview in the context of our experience and in my experience specifically over the last 25 years. What's important, and we're all trying to achieve here, is striking a balance between our clinical practice and then the business of medicine. And none of us should be ashamed about talking about the business of medicine. In fact, I think we all recognize that sometimes the easiest parts of our job are seeing patients and doing surgery, and the most challenging are the administrative aspects. And at no time ever has it been more challenging since what we've all been exposed to with the recent pandemic in terms of what it takes to run your practice and keep it sustainable so that we can rise to the occasion and still be existing in a different economy. So it's really as critical now as it ever has been before. What I've told the residents and the fellows is that it's not all bad. And obviously, we may have a different economy as we emerge from the current status quo and see where we end up in August, September, October, and so forth. But historically, when you look at starting salaries and so forth, for people coming out, they're not bad. They're in the $300,000 to $350,000 range. The bonuses are pretty healthy, and collections per RVU have stayed pretty stagnant in the, I would say, $75 to $85 or $90 range, even in 2020. The current status, though, is that we're placing a significant emphasis on healthcare costs versus revenue. There is an environment of increasing consolidation. We know we're seeing a significant outpatient shift of procedures that were traditionally performed in the inpatient setting. Physician employment models are still very relevant and becoming increasingly relevant. What's fascinating, though, in orthopedics, we still have a relative conservation of non-traditional hospital employment models. This concept of value-based care we should discuss potentially on the panel because it's ubiquitous, it's poorly defined, and various markets are profoundly underdeveloped when it comes to value-based care. There has been a significant emphasis on outcomes because outcomes now actually relate directly to reimbursement, and these value-based models now take into consideration outcomes and taking on risk as a provider, and that's directly related to our outcomes. The most important thing that I think that people can take home from this talk in terms of what's happening is that developing verticals to replace or augment professional compensation is probably the most important aspect of all of our practices. And that's assuming you're in a position to actually have an impact on that decision-making, because if you were truly employed, you may not have, obviously, access to the verticals that hospitals otherwise enjoy. And then I'll finish up with a few comments on where we are with private equity. It's very clear that healthcare expenditures continue to rise on a yearly basis. This never goes down. It always goes up. And it'll be interesting to see where we are in 2020. But in 2018, it was $4 trillion. So the emphasis by the government doesn't get less. It just gets more as they recognize the total allocation to the budget. When you look at how it's spent, I think it's important to understand while the focus seems to always be on the physicians themselves, we are only about 20% of that bucket. And what I try to help providers or payers understand is that, look, I know it's very easy to say, look, we'll just continue to pay you the same or less. They ought to be focusing on the hospital system, unnecessary overutilized care. That could be drugs, that could be compound pharmacies, that could be physical or occupational therapy. But the emphasis always seems to be anyway, at least to include physician reimbursement, which is really a small part of the overall healthcare spend. Reimbursement never goes up. It stays the same or it declines. The role of government payers is really predicated often on a geopolitical impact. Whether or not we have Democrats or Republicans in place has a huge impact. We're seeing exposure now to narrower networks that not only include requests in lieu of patients for discounts on professional services, but also for facility fees. And overall, there's just we're seeing reductions in benefits. This is sort of the state of affairs today. It leads to the conclusion then that ancillary revenue accounts for an increasing percentage of our total compensation. And this is really a geographical consideration. Years ago, when HMOs first came on the scene, for example, in capitated care, that was really a West Coast phenomenon. And many of us in the Midwest and the East Coast didn't really see the impact of managed care or capitated care. But now we're seeing, even though these are contracted care, they're behaving more and more like capitated care, and all of us are facing increased dependency on ancillary revenues. So what it leads to, if you just track over time, that we're seeing, this is some practice-specific numbers, just to give you a sense, the take-home was we're seeing a gradual decline in professional revenues. We're also seeing that what was previously very fragmented, because the cost of care and delivering care is increasingly is a number that just grows exponentially. If you think about it, to turn on the lights, whether you're a practice of 5 or 10 practitioners, or you're a practice of 30 or 50 practitioners, our overheads are awfully similar because of what the requisite constructs that are required to just open and run a practice. So simply turning on the lights has a significant fixed cost that is present whether or not you have 5, 10, 15, or 30 providers. Certainly there are marginal costs that we're all aware of as we increase the number of providers, but it speaks to the fact that to just set up shop, when you look at compliance and IT and insurance and real estate and size and scope and scale, it's becoming nearly impossible for small groups to exist. And this high degree of fragmentation now has led to a significant amount of consolidation, and that has paved the way for hospital-based practices, for private equity to come in and talk a little bit about that. The other thing that's incredibly important here is that we're seeing a profound outpatient shift. We now regularly perform multi-level spine, cervical and lumbar fusions, disc replacement. We will perform almost all outpatient joint replacement when it's covered. Medicare now will cover knee but not hip replacements, but maybe as soon as next year we'll see hip. Total shoulder arthroplasty, for example, anyone who's non-Medicare is performed in the outpatient setting. Anyone who can possibly be put in the outpatient setting, we are currently doing. The challenge is there's still some reimbursement pathways that don't cover all outpatient procedures, and they have to be performed in the inpatient setting. And also we have the obvious, which is patients need overnight hospital stays. But even that can be converted in a significant way to the outpatient segment for 23-hour stays. So that is the state of affairs, and that's entirely relevant. It may not be physician-owned hospitals, but it certainly speaks to physician involvement in the ambulatory sector and why it's so incredibly important that we participate when possible in facility fees, when previously the hospitals were never challenged in this environment, and they have in totality enjoyed facility fees. But these are the types of things now that you're seeing routinely go to the outpatient sector. And I realize this is somewhat geographic, but it is also largely governed by what Medicare will and will not cover in the outpatient setting. So then there's this concept of value-based care. And, in the narrowest way, it was always initially described as, well, lower cost is better value. And we know from Porter, the Harvard Business School, that value, his definition would be value equals quality over cost. And then that gets expanded where quality is not just what you think about, by outcomes, but it's the service, it's the safety, it's the readmissions, it's all of that stuff gets thrown into what quality is. And then cost is a very difficult number to get at, and it isn't always traditional accounting-based measures, but you can get at cost now, and you need to get at cost when you're talking about value-based care, because that's what the payers see. So all of us have to understand, for example, what does it cost to treat a patient 1 month before you see and treat them and 3 months thereafter? And what's entailed there? And is there a risk-based component of it? In other words, what if there's a readmission? What if there's a complication? And all of us have to become very well-versed, I believe, in actuarials, because now we're going to take a primary responsibility in value-based care. And if you don't, in my opinion, you're just going to be left out in the cold and not part of the narrative. So as I talked about, value-based care has typically been value equals quality over payment. And there's a lot of different models out there. There's pay for performance, which still has not yet taken off on the CMS side. There are gain sharing models that you can do with your hospitals, ACOs, Medicare Advantage, episode of care. We're seeing episode of care now products in Illinois, which previously were not existent. And we're looking at gain sharing with third-party payers. And then there's bundled payments, which take into consideration this risk sharing and risk transfer, and even warranties for care. That is very high level heady stuff, and it's an area that I would say that you got to think very hard about getting into, and you have to have sufficient size and depth before you would ever consider taking on risk sharing contracts. But you can get in to the value-based game and not have to take on significant risk. It is still very early in the process, and I would look at these gain sharing models that you see in the middle here, as well as things like BCPI. Outcomes is a big part of this. At this stage of the game, independent of your size, you have access to some outcomes tool. SOS has been affiliated, for example, with a number of specialty societies, OBERD, and now Patient IQ and REDCap. These systems have the ability on the front end to integrate with your EMR system when the patient walks in the door, and they have the assistant to do regular-based reporting for outcomes, not just for the payer, but even to the extent that you can publish on the nature of these outcomes that can be acquired through e-based platforms. I don't want you to be fooled in that to assume that just because you have these software programs and licensing arrangements that it just works by itself. Compliance still is a huge challenge, and even with full-time research associates that dedicate themselves to these platforms and front desk staff that dedicates themselves to having people fill out the little iPads, our compliance ranges between 50 and 70% at 18 to 24 months. It is still a very difficult process. On the physician employment side, we know now that private practice obviously can be single specialty, multi-specialty. We have some very successful multi-specialty non-hospital organizations that are dominating in the payer conversation that they can do that you and I can't do if we're single specialty. These are things that you have to think about. And then obviously there's the academic, private, or the private-demic sector. And I would say that we're sort of a private academic practice, but really function more like a private practice where I practice at Midwest Orthopedics. What are some of the compensation models? It's often been said that if you've seen one compensation formula, you've seen one. And that's very true. One of the most enjoyable riddles I ever get involved with when it comes to discussing the business of medicine is talking about compensation. And I always learn something when I talk to others about how they have their compensation models. But, many of you have seen these salary plus bonus and income guarantee or a floor. Very objective defined bonus metrics usually start after you cover your direct and indirect overhead. There are RVU-based agreements. My personal bias is against RVU-based agreements because they really have a poor nexus to how reimbursement happens. You and I know that the first procedure may be reimbursed at 100%. The second one may be at 25 or 50%. Everything else after that may never get reimbursement. Yet on the hospital side, they say, well, just show us your RVUs and we'll pay you. But if you are a private practice group, there is not a very strong nexus to an RVU and reimbursement. And that's a very important consideration. So we have not had great success outside the hospital system to have RVU-based formulas. And then there's the obvious sort of eat what you kill or collection-based. There are other forms of physician compensation, such as call pay, which is very common. Those range, I would say, market between $400 and $800 a night. Academic leadership appointments, especially if you have hospital affiliations, can garner additional compensation, such as being a chairman of the department or service line agreements. It is not uncommon for hospitals to seek service line agreements as a way to provide compliant reimbursement to build an arthroplasty program or to get a difficult physician into their program that they can't otherwise get because there isn't enough hand and wrist or isn't enough trauma. They can compensate those physicians through service line agreements and remain compliant or market-based. So those are things that if you're new or young in this area, you can look for. You can get call pay, you can look for leadership appointments, and you can navigate or negotiate service line agreements. Our model is basically an LLC, and it's essentially a full distribution revenue-based LLC, and it's essentially a form of eat what you kill, but we also have a socialistic component to it. In this model, where you basically count every penny, you can provide direct allocation of all your overhead, and then you just keep the rest. The challenge with this model, which I don't endorse, is that it doesn't really provide a group mentality. There's a lot to be said to having a hybrid model where you have some socialistic component. And the other side of it is sort of that group compensation formula where you do equal distribution. And this is a tough one because it doesn't really incentivize work, and it takes group collection, splits it equally. And I would say the only place this works is with smaller groups. I think personally, if you have to pick a compensation formula, this is the one that I subscribe to and can help anyone walk through it. But basically, you share indirect overhead. We do individualized direct overhead, so that basically incentivizes accountability, so that I'm not paying for high-priced assistance or administrative assistance for my colleagues if they want that. If they want 5 administrative assistants, they can have 5 administrative assistants, but they're responsible for it. We do a formula-based professional compensation distribution over a certain amount. Basically, we tax it, and that goes back to create a partner share. So basically, it's a socialistic model that allows people to do what they really feel comfortable doing and doesn't incentivize them to practice beyond the scope of things that they're comfortable doing. And so it's a hybrid of what I would say capitalistic and socialistic. And then we do, to keep people working, we take our ancillaries and we distribute them based upon certain RVU metrics. And this prevents legacy partners, for example, from staying in the compensation formula and not actually working or contributing to the ancillaries. And then we have full transparency for the wind down phase. The wind down phase is probably one of the most challenging things that any group has because, you know, unfortunately, the older partners are made to feel like criminals when they wind down because they're taking distributions and so forth, yet working less. And I think this is one that if you're going to spend any time in your group compensation formulas, spend a lot of time discussing how you deal with your emeritus partners in a very respectful way. Bottom line is, I think the best formulas maintain group mentality, they reward productivity, and they actually support low reimbursed subspecialties such as trauma and pediatric orthopedics and even tumor. If you want to be a full service line, you're going to have to support those service lines, and you do it for the benefit of the group. Now we'll sort of finish up and what beyond the professional revenue side, and these are all the things that are incredibly important. I think if you think about your practice as 2 components, your professional revenue and then everything else, you'll get a good sense of how you can say remain sustainable. Professional revenue decreases every single year. If you took a look at your patients who walk in the door and you think of them as, look, I can see them in the office and do their surgeries, and for better or worse, most of us, our self-esteem and our values predicated on how much we're doing. When you look at it in economic terms, that's a very small amount of what it brings to the bottom line. If you have the verticals such as physical and occupational therapy, MRI and imaging, maybe pain management, EMGs, DME, providing urgent care, maybe you have a rheumatologist that does infusion therapy, bracing and orthotics, and ASC, physician-owned hospitals. All of a sudden you start seeing that on the business side, seeing a patient in the office and doing a surgery, that's a very small part of what leads to the bottom line revenue. And this is the true orthopedic vertical practice. The driving philosophy is that private practice will always be able to provide higher quality, higher level of customer satisfaction, lower cost. They're smaller, they're more nimble, they can respond to the needs of your customers, they have lower overhead. And you, if you're fortunate enough to be in a private practice, have direct control over all aspects of patient care. What about the verticals to augment that private practice professional compensation? Well, it provides revenue opportunities with the patient at the center, as I've already told you. It provides vertically integrated care that you can control and provide best in class. And it prepares you for value-based care models because you actually control all the components that the payer actually sees. But the cons are it's very complex. It's really managing a business. There's a number of complexities that relate to reimbursement. There are some regulatory exposures that you need to be aware of. And there are some very high and some very low margin opportunities when you look at your verticals as additional compensation. The bottom line is that it really provides the power to the patient. And you're going to see, as these verticals unfold, free market. We now see, for example, that we're seeing commoditization, for example, of MRIs with decreasing margins. And that's because people on the outside are saying, look, come to our MRI facility. You have a $5,000 deductible. We're going to do your MRI today for $250. So there's an enormous amount of competition and compression of pricing in these areas. These are all the ancillaries that we are engaged in that if you're fortunate enough in a private practice model or to partner with a hospital or a hospital system that you too can be involved with. And they're the obvious things. The most challenging ones are the hospital JVs. Hospitals in general are far less nimble. They're often mirrored in regulatory pathways, attorneys and layers and so forth. And I find it very difficult often to get things done, but we do have some very important successful hospital JVs. But these are the ones that are worth contemplating. On the regulatory side, you really need to know your individual state, whether or not you're a CON state or not. PT, you can actually own independent PT as long as you oversee it, but they don't have to be physically on site. And that's a very important thing to understand because it allows you to start to build physical therapy networks to reduce your leakage. The STAR considerations are very important. They're meant to prohibit self-referral of a Medicare or Medicaid patient. There are a number of exceptions, such as your in-office ancillary. You can still adopt those same exceptions and have a physical therapy in a retail center outside of your office. If you don't comply, however, there are civil penalties. We've certainly seen increasing enforcement in this area in recent years, and you got to pay attention to these anti-kickback statutes, which prohibit payments based upon referrals. The in-office exemption, if you focus on this, it'll help you stay out of trouble. We disclose on our website ownership, alternative options for the patients. The ancillaries are controlled and supervised by the practicing physicians. They don't have to be on site. The profit from the ancillaries cannot be distributed based on referral volumes. That's a no-no. There are other ways to do it, though. You could do it by RVU based and actually make sure that people who are actually contributing get credit for it, but you can't do it directly based on volumes of referral. And you can also distribute that profit based upon ownership shares, seniority, or other predetermined metrics. And I would encourage you to think about that so that everyone stays in line. You don't have people sort of, for lack of a better term, freeloading on the system where people get disenfranchised along the way. MRI and CT is another routine part of the orthopedic practice. We offer same-day scans. It offers quality control, immediate access to your imaging, and you can control your radiology costs, have them on-site or remote, and that's been a big part of ancillary revenues. We've looked at it very carefully. The MRI cost per scan is about $385 in our practice. It offers the opportunity for depreciation over time. It does require real estate space, personnel. There is a professional fee component. And generally, we're upside down for Medicaid and Medicare, and we're right side up for commercial and workers' compensation. So you have to decide if you're going to use your scanner for Medicaid and Medicare and make a business decision versus a service decision. We have, this just shows you the Ortho Forum, which is about 35 private practice groups, 80 practices. This is where we were for just looking at our radiology, the contribution per FTE. Physical and occupational therapy is another one. It provides an essential element of an independent practice. Location is critical, and you can provide even a fitness or health club environment. These can be independently owned and operated. We can outsource through a management service organization, or you can take it all inside your HR and payroll and manage all your own billing, collections, or operation, or outsource that for a click fee per patient. I would tell you the management services agreements early on in the process are very favorable, but if you're using a commercial franchise to do your MSA, they are not going to be incentivized to make you best in class and optimize your business operations. Just keep that in mind. They may be excellent at what they do for themselves, but you are now in direct competition with them. So I would encourage you to think hard about that. What about your locations? Well, you can, those of you who don't have any, or a lot of these, you can probably set them up virtually anywhere and fill them. But look at where they come from. If they're going to have a freestanding facility, use your geocodes and maps and your patient distribution to sort of ascertain where you're going to send these patients. But the strategy is very complex. We provide bracing and splinting. We do FCEs, work conditioning, technology such as blood flow restriction, home programs, now telemedicine, and even adjuvant programs such as concussion management are all part of our programming. And physical therapy has turned to be a very profitable endeavor. And frankly, there's no reason in the world you should be referring these patients out if you can keep them in-house. The revenue opportunity has been tremendous. I will tell you that an established, well-running clinical practice can make a net profit of about $65,000 to $75,000 per therapist per year. Said another way, a reasonable-sized physical therapy center can net you $400,000 to $500,000 per year for your practice. DME, we didn't have DME early on. This delivers about $1 million to $1.5 million a year now for our practice. It was an afterthought, but it's done extremely well. Now that you have the ability to manage your inventory, which was the biggest challenge, this is another significant source of opportunity. Some of the other aspects on DME, I'm going to go past that, are the Ambulatory Surgery Center. I will tell you that this is something that we were a little bit late to the game, and now this is what basically is sustaining our practice. And I would argue that the hospitals were, in essence, laughing at us. The dollar amount that we were delivering to the hospital in facility fees was basically absurd compared to how hard you and I work each day. The bottom line is there are lots of barriers, but there's no reason if you're afforded this opportunity that you should not be in the ASC game as an owner. It's the single most important ancillary. There is business to be had on the orthobiologics front. I speak a lot on this. It does pose an ethical dilemma because you are certainly in a position to influence your patients. It is fee for service. We use it in the office for fee for service or a surgical adjunct. Keep in mind that you should have your patients sign an advanced beneficiary notice, and we bill the patient directly, and then we have the ASC or hospital bill us for the durable goods such as the syringes and so forth to avoid the patient getting billed twice. Last couple of slides, I'm going to finish now on private equity. All of you have seen a resurgence in the public sector about the role of private equity. Basically, the principles are that it invests other people's capital with an anticipated return of investment of 3 to 4 times over 3 to 5 years. That's their goal. That's their MO. It essentially creates a joint venture strategy or an MSO that separates all of the things you and I do from your PC. And you will either be a minority or a majority shareholder. Most of the arrangements are majority shareholders go to the private equity group. It's funded by retained earnings. So in other words, it's called a compensation scrape. What they do is they basically give you a tax efficient buyout on future earnings. So let's just say you make $100 a year. They'll say, we want 20% of that for in perpetuity. So you give them $20 every year from this point forward, and they will pay you some multiple of that $20. Recent private equity arrangements have been as high as 12 to 14 times your $20 retained earning. Keep in mind that it provides the opportunity for growth, and there's the opportunity to neutralize that compensation scrape through growth and basically what we call smart money. It's very tax efficient. It reduces risk on forward earnings, but the MD owns a shrinking percentage of the whole, presumably with increased enterprise value through growth. When private equity companies go into this, they have expectations for growth on physicians, locations, ancillary, rate lifts, and value-based risk contracts. So they're not going into this to get 3 to 4 times earnings over 3 to 5 years without assuming some element of control. I think it may be ideal for smaller groups that have a number of older physicians that are of similar age. It is not ideal for larger groups that have heterogeneously aged physicians because they start to do the break-even analysis and they say, well, look, moving forward, what are my risks? The unknown is what is most threatening. So that environment is changing rapidly based upon the current environment. So I would say, how do I know anything about all of this? Because I just know how to ask thousands and thousands of questions. It's not because I went to business school. It's because I pay attention to the details and I'm curious and I want to know. And probably the thing that I find the most irritating is just not being smart business people. We pride ourselves in being excellent physicians. We're blessed that we can be happy every day to go to work, to see patients and do surgery and be excellent at our craft. But frankly, it's been more important than ever now to stay viable and stay engaged, and never be ashamed to ask any question you need to ask. And there is no stupid question. And when you start to meet people who are very smart in this field, you learn that in very short order, you can be very comfortable with all the things that I've just talked about. So I want to thank you.
So Brian, thank you so much for summing it up. I want to, because our time is precious and we have a few other questions, I want to go first. Lou, you were in order. Is patient selection more important, or is pre-op education more important for safety and quality in the ambulatory surgery setting?
Are you referring specifically to outpatient joints, or?
I'm talking to outpatient joints and a little as well.
Yeah, so both are essential. I mean, there are evidence-based inclusion criteria currently for introducing patients into the ASC setting. That's going to be expanded over time as roughly half of all total joints move to the ASC setting in the next 5 years. But patient engagement is essential. Essential in the pre-op period in regards to their anticipations and their expectations. And then in the post-op period, the engagement to make sure that they don't unnecessarily access medical care. So you need to have some type of patient engagement platform like an O'Bird or a CareSense or a Force that touches the patients in the post-op period and negates that access to care. You also have to have nurse navigators that are very involved in the care post-operatively. These programs don't create themselves. They're very high-tuned machines that make that low complication rate and the bundle possible. Because as you know, if you have a complication in the bundle, you bust the bundle. Your costs can go up 50% if you have a hospital admission in the post-op global period. So the data that I showed before shows that these programs are not only possible, but are occurring now in the United States on a pretty broad basis. And as Brian alluded to, that talk that Brian gave was superb. I agreed with everything he said. I want to reiterate that if you're not getting into the ASC game and considering these type of payment arrangements, then you're going to lose ground. They've been telling us for 10 years that we're going to migrate to some type of risk-based payment methodology. Guess what? It's here, right? So it's here. So it has a lot. There's a lot of upsides to that too. For example, when you're involved in a bundled payment program, your payment per CPT goes out the window. You don't care what you get paid for the CPT, right?
That's right.
You're getting a bundle. So that's a way for us to get away from this ever decreasing position related to CPT, which is
Lou, your point is a great emphasis of why, most of us in medicine are also ego driven, and our sense of self or value comes from how many patients we see, how much surgery we do. But what you just said embodies exactly what the economics are. It doesn't matter what you get paid there. It's the bundle. But historically, we haven't been part of the bundle. And if you're not, it's absolutely not sustainable.
Yeah, we drive the episode of care, right? Let's take total joints for an example. We drive the episode of care. We're responsible for the episode of care. We take the liability in the episode of care. Guess what we get paid? 6%. Okay? That's not a good deal. By assuming the bundle, you get 100% of the episode of care.
Okay. Hussein, back to you for a second, then we'll go to Dr. Cole. Another 2 takeaway points from your whole lecture. Go.
So one for the individual, one globally. So for the individual, I've given you some simple tips on CPT, ICD-10 modifiers, real simple things. If you document well, you should help prevent delayed payment or lack of payment. And then globally, as everybody's already mentioned this, fee-for-service is killing us. We're going to keep going down in terms of our reimbursement. The only way we're going to survive is if we sort of unite as a group and try to sort of have a unified effort to show the value of what we do, whether it's through research or whether it's through our societies.
Al, I'll get back to you. Get that TikTok dance ready. I'm telling you. Dr. Cole, you've been incredibly successful to keep the groups intact. What piece of advice can you give to our membership at AOSSM here to keep in a big group, as you had, as you explained, members the best you can, happy, from the newest to the oldest. What do you think is some of your secret sauce that you've been able to share as a managing partner?
The first thing is, it's very hard to make decisions unless you know your numbers and know where your vulnerabilities are. Ultimately, it's about how people behave, are engaged, have passion for what they do, and they need to know that you appreciate them. And there's all the obvious things of running a business and taking care of your employees. But this recent crisis taught me that I couldn't make any decisions unless I understood the numbers. And all of a sudden you realize that, our day job is, as I said initially, is the easiest thing we do. You go do surgery, you take care of patients. That's the icing on the cake. If you're going to participate in your group or your organization on the business side, you absolutely have to understand the numbers to then make proper decisions. But I also tell you that, I learned how to be a CEO, or whether I'm good at it or not, I'm not entirely sure, but I learned how to, at an exponential pace over the last 3 months, because we had to make decisions about contracts and not alienate people from the process. And I learned that they often will compliment you, but if there's a problem, that's not the thing you're going to likely hear right out of the gates. So keeping your ear to the ground and asking the painful questions: who's dissatisfied? Who didn't get the messaging? Who didn't get the messaging frequently enough? And what you don't realize in the positions that we sit in, if you're running an organization, is that there's a lot of compartments in your organization: the front desk staff, the people who pick up the telephones, the people who do pre-certification, the case manager. I mean, there's all these compartments that you and I are not necessarily privy to. We have tons and tons of blind spots. So if you're in a position to sort of affect change and have a positive impact, get to know first your numbers, and then get to know the different compartments in your practice and get to know them well and give them access. The way that I learned to do that is I started having basically fireside every other week, fireside half-hour meetings where everyone would go on. It's a challenge because it's at the end of the workday to get complete engagement, but we had often about 75%. And it was amazing how that helped. And before every time I would do it, I would ask the leaders or the people who people report to, what are the active issues? And then I would ask some people on the street. I would walk around the clinic and say, hey, listen, what's going on? What are you guys saying? What do you need? What are you not hearing enough about? And sometimes you hear people are like, well, I feel we've been whiplashed around. We were told this and then that. And the first thing you do is get defensive to say, my intent was not to create, or our intent was not to create a lack of harmony or other, but we're reacting to an unprecedented situation. And the first thing you do is get a little bit defensive. If you take a deep breath and say, you know what, every criticism has a little bit of truth, and just accept that and do better, people appreciate that so much. And the first thing you need to do is just recognize that none of us are perfect, and you can always improve on the situation, but you don't know the problems unless you ask the hard questions, and you got to reach out to everyone, and there's no such thing as over communicating. So I think those have been things that have really been helpful. And we're so far from perfect, but if I rewind the last 3 months, for example, honestly, I would do most things exactly the same, except I might communicate twice as much as I have been, because you just realize that without messaging, people start playing movies in their heads and they don't know, even though you think things are fine and they're going to be fine. People are, with all of the tensions that are going on right now, you cannot take for granted the challenge that every individual is going through right now. So you just cannot over communicate or underestimate what people are going through.
So they say information gives confidence and silence builds fear. And
yep,
so you really did sum that up. Really,
yep, absolutely.
Al, as we're finishing up, because they're going to whip us on the stage with a cane, what's the number one thing we should not do when entering into social media, to whatever aspect?
Number one thing we should not do on social media.
Yep.
I would say in starting out, I would avoid, I would keep it to the medicine and I would keep your message very clean. So I would avoid non-medical discussions on your professional social media. Okay.
I can tell you, because we're getting the hook, that we could go on. This is an amazing group. And I really want to thank the AOSSM for allowing us to bring this together, this mini, so to speak, MBA. We look forward in the future to seeing all of you in person at annual meetings. Families need to be safe, healthy, and we really wish only the best for all of you. And on behalf of Lou, Al, Hussein, and Brian, and myself, we look forward to bringing this conversation again back to the annual meetings. You can write us all, and we'll try to answer those questions. It was a tremendous amount in a short period of time. But on behalf, I want to thank all my co-writers and academicians here in bringing us a little business to the aspect of medicine. As Dr. Cole said, it's true. I think the operating and seeing the patients is the icing on the cake, and hopefully this helps you feel a little more comfortable to be involved in your practice and empathetic and understanding what it's like to be a patient. I wish you all a great afternoon, and thank you for your time. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kevin. Great job.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.